Welcome. In this series, Washed, New Life in Christ, we will examine how the gospel of Jesus Christ can transform the lives of anyone, no matter where they have come from or what they have done. Paul writes in Romans how the gospel is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes. If you would like us to reach out to you, please fill out a Connect card on our website or app. We appreciate your prayers and financial support of this ministry.
Glad you're here. We are in this series, Washed, a New Life in Jesus, and I'm just excited to have the opportunity to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. A friend of mine texted me this morning, a preacher friend of mine up in Baltimore area, and he says, what a privilege it is to talk about Jesus' resurrection, and I hope that you find a blessing in today's message. I really do. I hope you find a sense of hope and a sense of new life. Those three words, He is risen, change everything, don't they? They really do when you consider how important they are. There are other stories in our culture, in our media, in books, that the theme of the hero dying and then resurrecting is a crowd favorite. I think of Spock being resurrected in Star Trek II. Any Trekkie fans? Oh, okay. Let's try another one. How about Justice League with Superman's resurrection? Okay, we got a couple head nods. Yeah, all right. I'll try one more. Alien 3 with Ripley's resurrection. Like, it's a quiet crowd. Come on, y'all. Bring the coffee in. Let's wake up. Hey, this theme of the hero dying and then resurrecting makes crowds smile and cheer and get excited. But when it comes to believing the actual resurrection of Jesus, there are a lot of skeptics. There are a lot of people that don't buy in for different reasons. And so we're going to be talking about that today. The past 4 weeks, or the past 4 messages in this series, we've been looking at different people in the book of Acts. So there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, first 4 books of the Bible, and then Acts. And Acts is about the beginning of the church. And so what we've been looking at is the impact of the gospel in different people's lives. First group we looked at were a large group of Jews from around different parts of the Roman Empire. They didn't necessarily believe in a resurrection. They come and they hear a message on the day of Pentecost, and many believe. And then the next person we looked at was the Ethiopian. The Ethiopian, he was from South Sudan. So he's very dark skinned. He was a eunuch. That means he was sexually altered at some point in his life to serve the Queen of Candace. And he finds out that he can become part of God's family through Jesus. And so he converts to Christ. Then we looked at Saul Paul. Saul was an enemy of the church, and he was on his way to Damascus to round up some believers and persecute them, take them to jail, even oversee their death. And he has that experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he becomes a believer. And so we've been looking at these different people. We talked about Cornelius the last time, and Cornelius was the first Gentile into the kingdom of God, and so it was just a big deal. Now this week, we're looking at the skeptics. And so Paul is in this city called Athens. Now Athens is the home of philosophers. If you went to university, you've probably read some works of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and some of these guys were actually born in this town. Now, when Paul gets there, they're all dead and gone, but the disciples of these philosophers are still there. And the two that pop up in the scripture we're going to read today is the disciples of Zeno. They were called Stoics. So a Stoic, they were all about a disciplined life. A disciplined life. If you were disciplined in life, then you could handle any type of problems, and you weren't necessarily pursuing any type of happiness. You were just pursuing control and discipline. And then there's the other extreme, Epicureans. They pop up in our text today. And Epicureans, they were the party people. They were like, life is all about, just a good time, and have a good time as long as it doesn't hurt you. Sounds a lot like, our world today, right? And among a lot of circles. And so anyway, This place, Athens, is the capital of philosophy and skepticism. It is like the pinnacle. And so you can still walk the streets and see some of the places that Paul preached. But anyway, Paul is there, and he's waiting on two friends to show up so he can continue his missionary journey of preaching the gospel in different cities. And so he's waiting on Silas, and he's waiting on Timothy, and he's waiting for them to show up. But while he's there, his heart becomes very burdened. Because as he's walking around the city of Athens, he sees all these different idols, and people are worshiping these idols, and it's breaking his heart because they're worshiping things they've made with their own hands. I was in India in 2001, and I remember going into several temples. One particular temple was just full of all these gorgeous, ornate idols. And families were going there, and their children were bowing down, and they were giving worship and paying homage to these different gods. And it broke my heart. Paul is having this experience. His heart is broken that these people are trapped in darkness. So he begins to preach. First, he preaches in the synagogue where there are people who believe in Yahweh, but they don't believe in Jesus. And then he goes out into the agoras, and it's a place where it's like a marketplace where people are doing business and law is practiced there. And so it's just kind of a very public square, and Paul preaches there, and then Paul is going to be taken to Mars Hill. So we're going to pick up this story of Paul's preaching in Athens. We're not going to read all of what he said, but beginning in verse 16 of Acts chapter 17, while Paul was waiting for them, his friends, in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city full of idols, so he reasoned in the synagogue, both with Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicureans and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What's this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So, we've got some professional thinkers. This is a think tank, Athens. This is where people get paid to think and talk about what they're thinking about. These deep thinkers cannot conceive of a man coming back from the dead. They don't have a story to put it in. As I mentioned before, we have movies and books and that these fictional stories that talk about superhero coming back to life, but they didn't have that, and they're having a hard time conceiving of the idea that a man could come back from the dead. Now, Paul is very tactful in his message to them. He compliments them on being deep thinkers. He even quotes some of their prophets or poetry, and so he's trying to engage them, but they're struggling to conceive of the idea that a man named Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross and rose from the dead. They're so perplexed, they take Paul to the pinnacle of Athens, and that's called Mars Hill. And when they take him up Mars Hill, this is where all the heavyweights are. This is where the best of the best bright thinkers and skeptics and philosophers are hanging out. And so they take him up there, and he says to them, he says, "For he," meaning God, "has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man," meaning Jesus, "he has appointed. He has given proof of him to everyone by raising him from the dead." When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. So in this cream of the crop philosophers gathered on Mars Hill and in the city of Athens, some respond to his message of the gospel by mocking him. Some want more answers, want more conversation about this topic, and some actually believed. Kind of an average day at church, isn't it? I mean, it's an average day. I mean, everybody's responding to what I'm talking about right now in different ways. It depends on where you're at in life and what's going on in your world. We used to have this elderly gentleman. He'd meet me at the door and he'd say, "Preacher, I get my best 30 minutes sleep here every week." And I said, "Thank you. I'm glad you're resting." And so, I mean, we have these everybody has different experiences, and this is certainly what Paul is experiencing. So take note of this. The resurrection of Jesus, the gospel. What is the gospel? The death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This emerges from a culture that's dripping with skepticism. This comes out, this flourishes, the gospel flourishes in a culture that has come to the end of all types of thinking, and they're just skeptics, they're just philosophers, they just really don't have answers to the big questions in life. They're struggling to make meaning out of life. And so the reason I mention that is that in today's culture, sometimes people look back at the birth of Christianity in the first century and they say, well, it's no wonder that people believed in Jesus. They were all very superstitious, and they would believe anything. Just the opposite. They were a tough crowd. They weren't sitting around numbing their minds on screens. They were dealing with life. Life was difficult. Life was short. Life was a challenge, and they're dealing with death a lot. They're dealing with deep questions, and they had a whole city dedicated to thinking about the big questions of life. And so, make no mistake about it, the skeptics were just as tough back then as they are today, and the questions were just as important. So, the resurrection begins to make sense to some of these, and it should make sense to us because it really is the natural thing that should happen. Death is unnatural. The resurrection begins the restoration of the natural order. Death is not natural. Probably all of us have had some type of experience like this, where we've stood by the coffin or the graveside of someone that we love that has passed away, and we say or think something like this: this shouldn't have happened. I don't like this. I don't want this. This is terrible. I never saw this coming. Like, we have all probably had one of those types of experiences where death doesn't make sense. But the resurrection does. Because God created life, sin enters the world and causes chaos to our universe, and that's how death enters into the world. It wasn't something God created, but it's the consequence of man's disobedience. And so we have this universal conflict that we all experience with death. And it affirms to everyone who's alive that death is not the natural thing. Life, and life abundantly, is what we should be seeking and expecting from a loving God. And so death enters in, and it doesn't make sense. And what happens is that God begins to restore that which is broken with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's no technology or medical science that can prevent death or create life out of nothing, but God can. And God did. And so we need divine intervention. We need outside help. There's probably a whole bunch of us that at some point in our life, or maybe even now, are trying to live life on our own with our own strategy, our own strengths, our own resources, and that will eventually come to an end where we can't, like death is one of these things. Like, how do we deal with this? Well, we need outside help, and God is that outside help. So if God can raise the dead, is it too much of Him to fix a broken marriage? If God can raise the dead, is it too much for Him to give hope to a cynic? If God can raise the dead, can He restore a soul that's drowning in depression? I'd like to just try to get you in your imagination to go back to being one of those people who is approaching the tomb of Jesus, the empty tomb of Jesus, on that Sunday morning. Just think about who you are, or someone that you know in a desperate situation who goes up that hill, and light emanating from inside that tomb where the angels are sitting. I can imagine a person battling cancer approaching that tomb and falling to their knees and going, if God can raise the dead, He can get me through this. I can imagine a couple that's their marriage is in crisis. It's on the rocks. And this husband and wife approach the tomb, and they see the empty tomb, and the husband says, He's risen. And he reaches over and takes the hand of his wife and says, God can fix what we've broken. I can imagine the man or woman, the soldier that's come back from the horrors of war and seen a lot of death and difficult things, and approaching the tomb and falling to their knees and saying, He is risen. Death is not the end. Can you see yourself with whatever burden that you're carrying? Approach that tomb and come to grips with the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, and then live in the power of the resurrection. And this is what I'm talking about. In this moment, we're talking about living in the power of the resurrection. That the resurrection isn't just an event, but it is a source of strength, a source of hope for whatever we face in life. There's this book called The Lord of the Rings, turned into a movie. And if you remember the story, there's a character named Gandalf, and he's sort of a Christ-like figure at different times in the story. But he faces this dragon, and the dragon carries him off to darkness, and he dies. But then later on in the story, spoiler alert, Gandalf comes back to life. And Sam, one of the other characters in the story, he sees Gandalf, and he says, Gandalf, I thought you were dead. And then he goes on to say, is everything sad going to become untrue? Is everything sad going to become untrue? Gandalf responds, he says, a great cloud of darkness has left the earth. You know, sometimes we live such defeated lives. We don't live in the power of the resurrection that's available to all who will believe. Romans 6:4 says that we were buried with Him through baptism, buried into the likeness of His death, raised like Him in order that we might live a new life. A new life. We actually can live differently through the power that raised Christ from the dead lives in us. The resurrection. The resurrection is the good news that transformed an empire. In spite of all the skepticism, in spite of all the disbelief, in spite of all the idolatry that saturated the Roman Empire, there are large numbers of the empire who come to believe. There are large groups of people who come to walk away from family idols and believe in the one Lord Jesus Christ. It was the early church that would go to the city dumps, and there the female babies were discarded on top of these trash heaps, because a female baby in Roman culture held very little value, so you just throw them away. But it was the church that went out and would pull those babies off the trash heap and raise them as their own children and give them new life. When the great plague swept the Roman Empire, it was the Christians that remained behind to nurture and be with those who were sick and dying. And when the plagues left, it was many of the Christians had stayed, some of them had died, taking care of the sick, and it was these people who converted an empire to believe in Jesus because of these acts of love and generosity. And so a person cannot simply dismiss the resurrection for a lack of evidence, for the evidence is overwhelming. The most documented fact in all of history is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All history points to this as being a credible thing. And the skeptics of the first century, many of those left their belief because of the overwhelming evidence. Here's a few facts of the resurrection. No disciple expected a resurrection. Nobody was looking for it. The disciples went and ran and hid. So they weren't looking for it. Many Jews didn't even believe in a resurrection. Another fact of the resurrection is that women were the first eyewitnesses to see Jesus. In the first century, a woman's testimony on any matter could not be entered into a court because it was considered uncredible. And so if you were going to make up a story about a resurrected Jesus, your first eyewitnesses would not be women, because that would challenge anyone who would read the story. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is an actual account of an actual event. And then thirdly, all the apostles died a martyr's death but John. I mean, they all died for this fact. And so while people have been known to die for a lie, it's almost impossible to find someone who would die for, people have known been died for different things, but it's almost impossible to find someone with full knowledge that it's false die for it. Chuck Colson, he was the henchman for the Watergate scandal for Nixon, and he says, I know the resurrection is true. He says, Watergate proved it to me. Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. They proclaimed that over 40 years, and they never once denied it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, or stoned, or put into prison, and they would not have endured that had it not been true. But then he switches and he talks about his scandal. The Watergate scandal embroiled 12 men, most powerful men in the world at that time, and they couldn't keep a lie 3 weeks. I mean, think about it. These men went to their death. And so, Paul, in this book of Acts, he meets some more skeptics a little later on in Acts 26. And these are high officials. One of them is Festus, and the other is King Agrippa and his wife. And he meets these people, and they're skeptical about the resurrection of Jesus. And Paul begins to preach to them, and he starts out talking about his conversion story on the road to Damascus, how he was once a persecutor of followers of Jesus, but now he is a follower of Jesus himself. And then he starts talking about the resurrection when he's interrupted. At this point, Festus interrupts Paul's defense, and he says, "You're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning has driven you insane." "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. This wasn't done in some dark place. This was done out in the open, this resurrection of Jesus. People saw him, and if you're honest with yourself, you've known about this. The evidence is overwhelming. You guys are the upper echelon of power, and you know if there was some kind of fabrication here, you all would have known about it. The only logical explanation to the resurrection of Jesus is that he did walk out of the tomb. Christianity is the only faith that says the first thing you must believe in is historical facts of the life, the death, and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. In other words, most religions or philosophies begin this way. They talk about a way of living, some practice, some meditation, some type of thing that you do, and if you do it faithfully enough and long enough, you'll experience some element of the divine. You'll connect with something beyond yourself. You'll find some internal peace. It's all about do this and experience this. But Christianity starts out this way. Here are the facts about the resurrection of Jesus. Whenever you read the preaching in the New Testament, you don't hear about things first about how to live. You hear about, here's Jesus, He's resurrected. Do you believe? Like, these are the facts. What's your answer? Yes or no? Because whether you answer yes or whether you answer no, there's consequences with both of those responses. And no one can be in the middle on this. At some point in time, we have to deal with this fact that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And so if we answer yes, it means we are giving away part of our lives or the authority. In other words, if you believe in the resurrection, you forfeit authority of your life to Jesus. So this is tough. There's nothing easy about this. The primary reason that I think people don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus is because they don't want to give up being king of their life. So Festus and King Agrippa, they understand the implications of dead man walking. They understand the implications. If this guy can over death, he certainly has more power than I do. And they would have to submit to his authority, which they're not likely to do because they're people of great authority and power. And so Jesus says that I am the Son of God, and I'll prove it to you. I'll walk out of the tomb, and he did. And so I'm just saying that we are prone to be skeptics of Jesus because none of us let go very easily of being the authority in our life. We like to be the king of our money, the king of our sexuality, the king of our purpose in life. And God says, look, I am king, and if you'll follow me, I'll bring you to new life. But if you're not willing to follow me, then you have to figure out all the difficulties in your life. It's all up to you. But as I said before, we need outside help. And then lastly, only the resurrection can deal with the big question. What's the big question? Death is the big question. Only the resurrection gives meaning to life and an answer for death. I think that one of humanity's biggest question is, what's the answer to suffering and death? Like, how do I process this? How do I begin to work through such difficulty? And Jesus and His resurrection is the answer. Quite honestly, there are things in this life that won't be fixed until the next. There are some things that are so badly distorted, so badly broken, that it will take a resurrection to bring new life into it. And so it's not just because of the external evidences that we believe in the resurrection. It's because it answers this central question in our heart of like, how do we deal with death? How do I process this? Now, we started out talking about these two groups of Stoics and Epicureans. So the Stoics said, live a disciplined life. Well, consider this. Consider this, you meet a Stoic, and you say, you have 1 hour to live, and I'm going to take your life in 1 hour. Do you think their disciplines would help them to prepare for that death? Or say you have the Epicurean, and you say, hey, Epicurean, what do you like to do? Well, I like to ski in Colorado, I like to drive fast cars, and eat chocolate pie. And you say, okay, you got 1 hour to do whatever you want, and then I'm going to take your life. Do you think they could enjoy any of those things? The answer is no, it's ridiculous. When death is imminent, all you think about is that and how you're going to get through that. And Jesus says, I know how to get through that. As a believer, we hold the hands of those who we love on this side of life. And then as we approach death, Jesus just simply takes the other hand and leads us through. It's really that simple. We have such a hope. We have such a hope in Jesus when it comes to dealing with life's biggest question. The reason that suicides are on such an increase in our culture today is because people believing and practicing Christian faith is on such a decline. And if we want to give hope to the hopeless, they have to believe in Jesus who conquered death. I'm going to be at the Next Step room, and if you'd like to have a prayer or a conversation, or you just like to tell me your story, I'm going to be back at the Next Step room, and you'll have an opportunity to do that.
He is risen. 3 small words that brought the collective pace of humanity to an absolute standstill. He is risen. 3 words that shattered prisons. Words that shook the earth's foundations. Words that transformed a sense of utter despair into cries of pure joy and ecstasy. Echoes of history's greatest triumph that still shape our reality. Even today, we're assaulted by constant distraction, countless sources waging war for our attention, yet 3 words pierce the noise. In our hunger for validation, our desperate pleas for love and attention, 3 words calm our anxieties. In a universe spinning at breakneck speed, its inhabitants locked in an existential crisis, 3 words proclaim the purpose of our existence. He is risen. Lay hold of this truth and embrace the peace within. Yesterday, fear reigned in our hearts. Yesterday, we sat in crippling darkness. Yesterday, we suffered abuse and all the accusations of a broken world. But today, our King, our healer, our defender is risen. And this reality doesn't merely accompany us on a meaningless journey. This changes everything. For you see, if he is risen, then all other pursuits become secondary. All of our failures become insignificant. All criticisms and condemnations become irrelevant. There is only his word, his mission, and his infinite, unconditional love for you. Because he is risen, we look to tomorrow. Tomorrow we will stop defining our worth through status and social media. Tomorrow we will together build an everlasting kingdom. Tomorrow and every day after, we will dance in the radiance of a redeeming Savior who crushed death and set us free. There is nothing that Jesus cannot overcome. We know this because he lives. We know this because he is risen.
Thank you for joining us. You can find us on the web at cornerstonechatham.org.